Trailing north. In 1884 came the thrill I had been looking for, to take a herd from Texas and deliver it safely into the Northern Territory. Cattle land in Texas, in spite of the millions of acres of grazing territory, was pretty well taken up by this time, and the cattle that could be bred more easily in Texas could be driven north to grow on the fattening grasses of Montana's lonely acres. We started north in 1884, just after the spring breeding season, with a herd of about 3,000 head. A part of one of the last big cattle drives from Texas. Our herd was about a fourth of the whole herd, which came up in 4 sections of about 3,000 head each, making about 12,000 head in that drive of 1884. We started from Fort Clark on the Rio Grande, and the first stop was Montage, in the Red River. From Montage, the herd took the Monument Hill Trail, which was then through Indian Territory, the part that is now Oklahoma. All cattle starting north on the trail were given a trail brand, and there would be a man left at the central points along the way for a number of days after the herd had passed through. This man would look over the other herds that came in, and he could claim all the cattle bearing the brand of his outfit, no matter who brought them. The way an expert could look over hundreds of head of cattle and classify them according to brands was almost uncanny. Perhaps you've heard of Frank Dobie? He's no amateur on brands himself, but he says that Lod Callahan, head inspector for the Texas and SW Cattle Raisers Association at Kansas City stockyards for some time, could tell what brand an animal had on it by tasting the beef. We had a crew of 10 or 12 cowboys to handle 3,000 head. When it was near time to bed down for the night, the point men would lead the herd off the trail. The swing men would allow the cattle leeway, and the herd would start grazing. The trail boss usually had the camp spot picked out hours before it was time to turn off the trail. To be sure of good watering and grazing, I would often lead the herd by as far as 20 miles and cover twice as much territory as when riding herd. Having a watering place spotted, we could judge the rate of speed the herd would have to make. Within about 2 miles of the camp spot, the crew there would throw them off the trail and the cattle started grazing, and by the time the spot was reached, the cattle were full and the leader was ready to lie down. Then the swing men closed in, and sometimes the entire herd would follow the leader and lie down at once. That was a sight to see, a herd of 3,000 stretched out over several acres. But this was unusual. It was generally a slow job to crowd the herd into the bed ground so gradually that they were all given time to lay down. Besides the crew of cowboys and the trail boss, there was the cook and the horse wrangler. The horse wrangler, usually a young boy, looked after the ramada, which might consist of from 5 to 10 horses to the man. Besides this, he was expected to rustle wood for the cook. Getting firewood on the Kansas plains wasn't always easy, but on one occasion at least, our wrangler collected it in a hurry. We were out of Oklahoma Territory and headed for Dodge City, Kansas. The rush to settle Kansas during the days of the slavery dispute had been followed with a depopulation reaction, and a number of little towns that had had from 150 to 200 people were entirely deserted. On this particular night, I remember having seen one of these well-deserted villages not far from the chosen campsite. When the wrangler reported to me that there was no timber to be found for the night's fuel supply, I rode up the knoll with him and pointed out the ghost city. There were 2 irregular rows of dilapidated frame buildings forming a wide street. Through the shadows of the coming twilight, I could make out a huge barrel-like thing that was centered on the town's one street. After looking until my eyes were adjusted to the dark, I made it out to be a rustic old well that really gave character to the spot. The wooden stays that formed the visible frame of the well were still intact, and even the old bucket hung from an arch over the frame. I had almost forgotten our wrangler in picturing the group of languid, contented Southerners that I might have seen around the well smoking and basking in the sun had I passed the spot on any summer afternoon before. My wanderings were brought to an abrupt stop when the object causing my fancies was literally jerked from before my eyes and went bounding down the main street, stirring up a cloud of dust that nearly blotted out the town. Our wrangler was the cause of the commotion. While I was dreaming, he had gone down the knoll, trotted around the edge of the slope, and entered the town at a gallop. Throwing his lasso as he neared the well, he roped the rustic old structure and continued at a gallop, With the lasso rope tied to the saddle horn, he lifted the well structure from its foundation, and it went bounding after him, as he rode out of town in a cloud of dust and disappeared around the knoll to the campsite. I turned my horse and followed him back to camp. He stopped behind the mess wagon, dismounted, and getting the axe, soon had the well housing reduced to a fuel heap. The remaining member of the crew was the cook, and he was a character. His official position, while we were on the trail, was at the helm of the supply wagon. The mess wagon, as we called it, often had to be loaded for as many as 300 miles, and that meant a limited supply of everything and careful vigilance on the part of the cook. For most part, the supplies consisted of coffee, bacon, beans, and flour. The coffee that was carried was unparched coffee, bought in 100-pound containers. Part of the kitchen equipment was a Dutch oven, and the cook used this to roast the coffee as was needed. The oven was really built for service, and even the familiar beans and bacon weren't so bad when they were baked in it. The fire was burned down to bright coals, then the coals were raked out, and the oven was buried in the embers, full of beans and bacon, while the live coals were heaped over it. When the contents were done, the red-hot lid had to be lifted off with long tongs. The cook never had to sound the dinner gong more than once. When we heard the first bang of his big cooking ladle on the dish pan, we were ready to line up, and by the time the echo was dying away, we were ready for beans and bacon. The daily schedule was much the same. At least we tried to make it the same by overcoming the variable elements we met with along the trail as best we could. During the day, I kept far enough ahead of the herd to know where the next watering hole would be. We tried to regulate the speed of the herd so as to bring them on water at noon. Then we grazed them until 2 o'clock. The 2 o'clock threw them back on the trail and would make about 7 miles to some dry ridge where we would set up a dry camp. The number of miles the herd could make in one day depended on the grass and water supply. It was usually between 15 and 20 miles a day. Lack of food or water, strange noises, or prowling animals kept up the constant hazard of a stampede at night, so the night watch was a very important part of the trailman's duty. The first guard went on at 10 o'clock, the second at midnight, the third at 2, and the fourth guard held from 4 until morning. If a member of the crew was responsible, or rather irresponsible, if he had imagination, if he was highly sensitive, or had a depth of emotion, the night guard brought it out and gave him some of the greatest experiences of his life. Ogallala, Nebraska, a central north and south point in the state, was the farthest north a Mexican would come. This town was a dispersion point. From here, the herds that had been following each other on the trail from Texas scattered out like a fan. Some of the cattle were sold for market. Some were sold to local western and northern ranchers. When we started northwest from Ogallala, we felt like we were really serving connections with our native land, and after we had reached Montana and experienced a few months of that terrible winter of 1884 and 85, we began to think the Mexicans knew what they were doing when they turned back from Ogallala. A short time after we hit the trail northwest from this city, I experienced one of the few incidents of human relationships on the trip. Maybe I should do a little explaining first. You see, in the old trail days, the number of head of cattle slaughtered on one trip would make up a good herd now. There might be as many as 1,000 calves born in a good-sized herd on one trip, and slowing up the herd for each one would be out of the question. We couldn't leave them to the wild animals that lurked behind a trail, so the only humane thing to do was to take them from their mothers at birth. But this complicated matters for us. The mother cow would not resign herself to go on without the calf. With every opportunity, she would break from the herd and head back. We met this situation by means of a very modern-sounding process, necking. That means that we would bind the mother cow and a steer together by means of a rope fastened around their necks, allowing a space of a couple of feet between. The steer is all for staying in the herd, and the unwilling mother is dragged from the scene of the tragedy and after about 6 days is resigned to go on. One night the outfit was making camp at the head of Dry Beaver Creek, northwest from Ogallala, and 2 creatures appeared that caused a big disturbance in camps. No, not buffalo, nor bears, nor Indians, but these 2 were 2 very sweet little white girls, and that was a sight so uncommon that the camp had a real excuse for getting excited. Anyone who had ever learned anything about chivalry dusted off his manners, and the roughest of the lot were at attention when the girls came into camp. We learned that their father was homesteading on Dry Beaver, and that they lived in a lone log cabin that we had entirely overlooked. It was rather a blow to find that they weren't in line to be rescued, but the real blow came when they explained their purpose in coming to camp. We were dumbfounded when one of them said they would love to have some fresh milk. The girls just took it for granted that in a herd of that size, milk would be a plentiful object, and that conclusion was quite logical and natural. But to expect to get milk from cows as wild as our Texas trail herd was a terrifying idea to this bunch of trail hands who wouldn't have tackled milking a family pet, let alone these wild creatures. The expressions on the men's faces showed reactions to this absurd request, but there were none of them favorable. Disgust, disappointment, wonder, and amusement. No one showed much inclination of ever considering complying with it. The disillusionment of the girls was no less evident. If they had had any experience with cowboys before, they must have thought that this was just a dumber bunch than usual. When I saw the embarrassment that our hesitation was causing the girls, I felt ashamed for all of us. I didn't know anything about milking cows myself, but something in me said I couldn't let the girls think that because we were cowboys and seldom had a chance to associate with women, we didn't know how to treat them. I explained to them that these cows were never milked, but that when the herd was bedded down, I would do my best to get some milk. There were several cows that had to be necked that night, and I made up my mind to make an attempt at any cost to get the milk. Kitchen utensils were at a premium, as were any manufactured articles in the wilderness. I dreaded tackling the cows for milk. Finally, I managed to get a hold of an old lard pail, and I took it with me as we rode out to the herd. The boys looked at me sideways, and I wasn't flattered at the implications in their glances. I could feel Jed's eyes. Plumb local, he was thinking. We hog-tied and threw the cows and steers to be necked, then tied them together. This didn't help the animals' dispositions. The fellows were pretty decent about roping the cow for me. I knew they were interested in my efforts, and I knew that at some distance the girls were staring wide-eyed at this unique demonstration of milking a cow. It would have been a bad influence on the animal for me to show nervousness, and I went to it like I knew all about milking. I don't know what happened, but I got what I wanted, though lots of it was wasted on the prairie before I managed to hit the lard pail. When I had the pail full, I was pretty warm. I hurried to get away from the vicinity of the cows before she got really unfriendly. It had been such a trifling matter to make such a fuss about, I hardly knew quite how to act. I felt the surge of satisfaction that came from knowing I had so easily accomplished what was to the others beyond possibility, or at least was below their dignity to attempt in public. I realized that all eyes in camp were focused on me, and an impulse to finish the act with a flourish swept over me as I approached my horse. If I had been acting according to reason, I would have noticed the attitude of my horse and have taken precautions. But just then I was primarily concerned with the figure I was cutting, and if I saw the distended nostrils and wild eyes of the horse I was about to mount, they didn't register. Taking hold of the pommel of the saddle, I held the lard pail in my right hand as I swung into the saddle. I cleared the horse's flanks with a wide swing of my right arm and fell into the saddle with a bow befitting a circus performer. The milk pail fell into place at my side with the contents almost intact. But the difference between almost and all, in this case, was immense. The few splashes of milk that lapsed over onto the horse was all that he needed to set off his already high pitch of excitement. He was off like he had been given pointed spurs, and I came out of my reverie with a jolt that lifted me several feet in the air. I came down again on the saddle and concentrated on holding the milk pail right side up. With each bound of the horse, the milk splashed higher, and with each splash, the horse was aggravated again. As a general rule, I ride with my horse, but this time I was every place he wasn't. With a particularly violent leap, he sent the milk pail and me flying into space. I lived, but right at the time, I wouldn't have cared if I didn't. I couldn't really tell you how many different things I was concerned about when I came to, but the first thing I concentrated on was the empty milk pail. You think a bunch of college fellows can give you a razz? Well, you haven't had experience with cowboys. I gritted my teeth and tried not to listen to what they were saying, picked up the empty lard pail, walked back to the herd, and managed to get another pail of milk. Things don't bother me usually, but I must have been the picture of embarrassment when I walked that gauntlet of railing cowboys to hand the pail to those girls. That night, as we sat around the campfire, there were plenty of wisecracks circulating about Knights of the Floating Milk Pail, our mounted milkmaid, and the Dairy Hero, and worse. I was smiling in spite of my aches, but the source of amusement wasn't the wisecracking I was trying not to hear, as I looked into the fire and saw the understanding faces of the two sisters. And I was hearing again the shorter girl say after she thanked me for the milk, "Don't mind what these men say. I'm sorry and I hope you're not hurt." The trail into Montana led through Fort Keogh and Miles City, and from here we headed for the mouth of the Musselshell River on the bank of the Missouri. Our section was the first of the big herd to take advantage of the northern pastures. We made our camp about the 1st of November.